Hello and welcome back to Crypto Sapiens. Today's episode is a bit different than others you may have grown familiar with. It is one of a four-part mini-series that explores journalism and Web3. DeJourno is a series hosted by Crypto Sapiens with the help of a DeJourno DAO and other top builders in the Web3 and journalism space. It seeks to return to the roots and definition of what journalism is all about and to demystify the concepts and tools in Web3 that can aid in the process of decentralizing journalism. We hope to present to you, our dear listeners, with many of the novel applications that are being developed today. I truly hope you enjoy this content and find it useful in your crypto journey. So let's get started. Hey everybody, welcome back to episode 4 of the DeJourno series. In this series, we have talked about Web3 and journalism. We talked about the foundations of journalism in the first episode. In the second episode, we talked about some of the tooling that journalists can use to go more Web3 friendly. And then in the third episode, we talked about censorship. And, we solved censorship in that 1 hour episode for good. So not really. We still have tons more to talk about. And today we are going to be tackling the concept of public goods in journalism. Should journalism be a public good or is journalism a business? And how can Web3 help journalism bridge those two worlds? Okay, so I guess we can start with just some brief introductions of who we have here. So we'll start from the top with Keith.
Hi, Keith Axline. I'm a software developer in Portland, Oregon. Previously worked at Wired Magazine and Medium as an editor before I became a software developer, and joined DeJourno DAO early on, and I'm excited for all the projects that we have going.
Hi, I'm Crystal Street. I live near Boulder, Colorado, and I'm a community builder in the Impact DAO space. Entered this space around 2017 professionally, and was a former photojournalist for several decades. And yeah, excited about all the stuff we've got going on here.
Hey guys, I'm Spencer. I have a background in film and television, and I originally got into Web3 through financial speculation maybe around 3 years ago. And then I gradually started learning about the non-financial applications, and that's what really got me interested. And I met Eric through Discord around a year ago now when the DeJourno DAO server first started, and since then have been helping DeJourno DAO in various ways, and it's been a privilege.
Hey everyone, been in the space since 2016, speculating at that time, wondering what Bitcoin was, like I think a lot of people were. 2018 is when I started building, founded the first business that I did in Web3. Looked very different at that time than it does today. The tooling for a lot of decentralized organizations didn't exist, so we built a lot of them from scratch. Around 2020, I became really interested in decentralized identity. I started contributing to a few different projects, including Ontology, Bright ID, to understand that a little bit better. Founded Crypto Sapiens to facilitate these types of conversations across the global community, and now I'm building something new. I'm pretty excited to reveal it soon.
So I guess with the introductions aside, we can start with just some of the basic concepts of it. First of all, I do want to start with the definition of public good. What is a public good? It can mean, well, I don't know if it can mean a lot of things or not. I'll let you guys decide that. But according to Wikipedia, a public good is a good that is both non-excludable and non-rivalrous. So anybody want to break that down and define what non-excludable and non-rivalrous mean?
I can take a stab at it. To me, non-rivalrous means that there isn't like a limited sum of it, so it's not consuming it isn't competitive. You can think of open source code doesn't have a limited amount of times it can be copied, whereas certain natural resources have some limited amount, and so there's a kind of a competition for who can claim it or consume it. And then non-excludable, I believe, means that it can't be put behind some kind of paywall or put behind some kind of exclusive gate or something to limit who can access it. But I could have that definition wrong.
Yeah, that's pretty accurate there, Spencer. So public goods really kind of started, it started hundreds and hundreds of years ago, but in the modern context and the way we use it, it really kind of stemmed from voluntary simplicity movement in the 70s. And then it also coincided with a lot of the early computing ecosystems from the 70s. And like what you're saying, Spencer, it really generated from hackers who were trying to build technology that was completely open for anyone to use. And they tried to maintain that until, Microsoft and some of the big corporations came along in the late 70s, early 80s, and then they began to do market enclosures on this on these public goods. So that's where you really saw this split in the computing community, in the hacker community too, where they were trying to maintain the code to make it completely open. That's kind of where you saw Linux and Microsoft kind of make that split. So, and that's kind of like the foundation for where we are now. I mean, blockchain is kind of a revitalization of that original ethos of that hacker community.
I think one of the people that has done a really good job at explaining public goods, and I think that's just because that's been the focus of one of the companies that he helped to found in the space, is Kevin Owocki, who's recently disassociated from Gitcoin. But that is something that he helped to develop in the early days because of that need for funding these public good projects, right? These services, open source software, as I think someone mentioned earlier today. One of the things that he likes, I think I've heard him say, is talk about like air and water, right? Like these are things that are non-excludable. Like access to air is non-excludable. Access to water is non-excludable. So I think thinking of it from that framework maybe gives us a good perspective in terms of the way that we can look at public goods and, kind of the need for protecting and supporting the development of public goods in general.
And along those lines too, to tie it into journalism, one of the big stories that was broken back in the 1950s by Edward R. Murrow, that really brought to light the difference between commercialization and journalism as a public good, where he had to fight with the executives at CBS in order to get the resources to continue attacking is not the right word for journalism, but to going after Senator McCarthy during McCarthyism. And that story eventually brought down McCarthy. But there was a huge rift between the advertisers, executives, and journalism itself. And in one of his speeches after he won an award for that project, he really ripped into the structure of media and how it needs to be a public good. And if not, then you will always have this commingling of corporate incentives and it dictating the narratives that we produce.
Is information, or what information is public good? And by that same thread, is the internet a public good that supports access to information?
Maybe you can make an argument that certain private information shouldn't be available as a public good, but I'm not sure where to draw those lines. But in my mind, in general, public goods at least notionally go towards some kind of common opportunity and increasing common opportunity, because we don't, obviously opportunity isn't equally distributed. And the idea is that public goods can help at least notionally increase the kind of the bottom total shared level of opportunity or resources that people have. And information now it's almost up there with air in terms of how important it is. But I'm not sure where to draw the lines of what information should be a public good and what should be private.
Yeah, it looks like we just had Eric Mack jump on as well. We're talking about basically defining public goods right now as non-excludable and non-rivalrous.
Sure. Okay, great. We jump right into Econ 101. It's early in the morning, but I think this is, sorry, can you hear me now? I'm on a new router. Yes. New router, who dis. So, I think this is one of the great struggles of like the last 150 years, actually, is this for control over, what is in the public sphere and what is in the private sphere. And I think those lines are shifting all the time. And it kind of comes down to what the public demands, and in many ways over the last 50 or so years, the private sphere has really won in clawing back a lot of control over information in particular. I mean, the internet started out and the actual protocols remain a public good, but everything that's been built on top of that, as I'm sure Chris already talked about while I was fritzing in and out, has been private. And so, I would think it's probably time for the pendulum to swing back the other way. And because I think we're seeing, some of the dumpster fires in action of things that should be public goods, but that are treated as private commodities.
Yeah, I think we've been in like a sweet spot for a while where like consumers or just people were okay with the privatization of journalism and news because the end product was like, better than what they had. It was good. Nobody felt like they couldn't get the information that they wanted. And then I think it's only when that stops being true, then we start evaluating like the principles and the foundations that, our information is built on. And I think there's a demand for that. That's kind of one of the few things that's uniquely crossing across a lot of different agendas and desires right now. And I think that I'm excited that the focus has been brought back to public goods, and the lack of prioritizing public goods is like a lot of the reason why we're here. And so if we can make that a top priority again, and everyone realizes that in order to get what they want, no matter what they want, we need to have like a solid foundation of public goods in place.
I just wanted to ask this real quick. Air and water are something that is made naturally. It's free. It's abundant. It's all around us. Things like code has to be made by somebody. Things like journalism and watchdogs and things like that has to be created by humans. So somebody's got to pay for that. Somebody has to help support those people who create that stuff, unlike air and water. So how do you mitigate that?
Actually, I think that's a perfect example to why Gitcoin exists, right? It is basically, it exists to be able to provide a platform for organizations to come together and fund that, but also communities and individuals to do the same thing. So I agree, there's a cost to producing some of these goods. It's a matter of prioritizing where our money is spent, right? And so, I think that's why I come back to, and I think there's more platforms than Gitcoin, obviously, but I think that for me at least is one of the more familiar ones, and it's why I tend to use them more often as an example.
And sorry, Crystal, I didn't mean to cut you off. I really just wanted to ask that question. I'll let you continue.
Oh, no, that's okay. It's a great question because in the past, media was was supported through a lot of government money, a lot of subsidies. It helped and still is. NPR is partially funded through donations and also, government subsidies. So in the absence of those vehicles, we definitely need to explore different alternative economic systems, which is why we're all here. One thing I did want to mention with Keith and Eric's point is that one thing we are exploring here, I think, as a collective, is how to unravel the market enclosures that Web2 brought in to the space. And we talked about this in some past podcasts. I think it dovetails into the funding question as well. How do you unravel that market enclosure when it's so strong? And when we saw like Twitter at scale is now the town square, but it's now owned by, questionable billionaire.
I would just add, that journalism's in like a really kind of weird space because it's really only accountable, or should only be accountable to the truth and to delivering the truth to its audience. So it's in a weird space where it kind of needs to keep like all funding models at a distance while also like depending on them. And what I mean by that is like it's like so maybe we don't like privately funded media and news so much, so I guess we should make it publicly funded, but it's like that's not really the answer as well, because it's important for journalists to remain skepticism towards governments and like all institutions of power. So there kind of has to be, it's never going to be easy, which I think is why it's been hard to do away with the advertising model, because while it's not ideal, like being completely state funded makes you a propaganda arm, which is why I think there's some real interesting potential in Web3 in terms of being able to provide real community-based financial support that is kind of quasi-private and quasi-public, and it's kind of a fascinating third way, I think.
I think we're waking up from this this sort of inherent perception that public goods are they're kind of neutral on the value spectrum. But I think what we're starting to find, and what I think is true, is like our perspective expands to account for more and more things in the economy, is that there's a lot of value circulating because of public goods, and it's mostly being pulled out of public goods and then given to like private organizations. And I think I'm open to the fact that like there might be a world where you could get the incentives aligned, where there is like an actual feedback loop of value back into the public goods, and that everyone prioritizes them because it's acknowledged that that's in everybody's best interest. It's kind of like you don't get Facebook without the internet, and you don't get the internet and the way that Facebook can build on it if it's not a public good. And so if we want our economy to expand, if we want productivity to continue to increase at like exponential levels, then we need these unlocks, and public goods kind of raise the floor of that we can all build on. And I think I'm optimistic that even the most like selfish capitalist will kind of start thinking more in the long term, because we've seen like the short term thinking just kind of like runs the same course again and again. But if we can all collectively raise the floor, then everyone can, build very profitable, successful things on these new public goods. And then, we can raise the floor again, and we can keep ratcheting up and keep delivering value to more and more people, and just making things more equitable while also keeping that profit cycle going. I think you need both, really. And we've been too much on the extraction profit side, and we need to go back and ratchet up the floor.
What I'm finding interesting, and this dovetails with what Keith just said, as a lot of journalists are heading over to Mastodon, their chatter is fascinating, because they're looking for the features that were present in Twitter in a centralized platform. And they're like, why aren't these features here at Mastodon? So now they're actually understanding that those features were made by a centralized entity. Now they're on a decentralized platform. So it's up to the person that runs the server really to code that into the system. So they're really having to look hard at how they use these platforms, why they use them, and then who controls them. And that's fascinating to watch journalists in scale migrate to something like this and try to figure it out in real time openly. I'm completely fascinated by that transfer.
So what incentivizes the people to add in that type of extra functionality if it's an open source, non-funded platform in a way?
I think they just have to want it enough, and they have to have the developer skill set like Keith has to like sit there and look at it and say, how do I solve this problem? Either I'm gonna have to solve it myself, or I'm gonna have to find somebody to solve it for me. And in the past, you would just complain enough to a centralized platform, and then maybe they would build it. But now they just have to build it themselves, so now they have to actually understand how these platforms really work.
And this gets at a critical thing in my mind, is if we're talking about public goods almost competing with private goods in terms of business models, it's almost like there's some competitive disadvantage for public goods in terms of funding. And it almost requires public good oriented journalists to make that kind of sacrifice in terms of, I guess, like career opportunities perhaps, or they have to believe in it enough to offset any kind of career disadvantage with going the public good route. And in my mind, a lot of public goods is predicated on there being people that are so motivated to make those kind of sacrifices. And it brings in a lot of interesting questions for me.
In my mind, like the way this can be solved is if we actually materialize and make explicit all the value that people get out of public goods journalism. It's like once we kind of outsourced funding of journalism to like the government or being subsidized by advertising, then the value kind of got really murky for everybody, and it felt like air, but then like you had to pay for it sometimes. Now that like I've just been breathing this whole time and now I have to pay for air. And we need a way for the people collectively and individually who derive value from having like quality journalism at their fingertips every day, to actually support that endeavor directly without going through these like diluting mediums of advertising or government. And I think that's why Web3 is interesting in just building a direct value transfer relationship with a journalist individually or like a news organization, and making that explicit. And it is like a mind shift, I think, on both sides, both from the publisher journalist side and the consumer side. But I think things are breaking badly enough now that I think that conceptual shift is worth making for a lot of people.
I mean, that's an interesting point. I hadn't thought about it like that, but I do agree where if we're better able to quantify the value of public goods, people may be able to better recognize how much they were benefited from public goods and may feel more willing to kind of give back in that public goods spirit, or be willing to recognize, you know, like certain trade-offs that they wouldn't be able to recognize if those public good benefits continued on being invisible like air, or like so easily able to be taken for granted. I think that's a really interesting point.
I find that projects like Giveth.io and Doing Good find a way to invest in a public good while still being able to make a profit as a donor. Do you think there's a type of moral quandary there in order for people? Because people, whenever they donate to a public good, that's pretty much it. They just throw the money down the funnel and it's gone, and they just have to write it off as the tax write-off. So Giveth has a structure in which people can receive those Give tokens back for donating, and then they plug it into their DeFi platform. And then people can, in a way, donate and speculate.
I mean, I could be, I'm not familiar with how Giveth does it, and I could be missing something, but at least in my mind, the only way to reconcile public goods with return on investment is if there's enough donation volume for there to constitute some kind of profit for investors. I mean, maybe there's some other way to balance those two, but I almost think if there's anyone involved that's expecting some profit or return on investment, then it seems difficult, if not impossible, for the product of that whole arrangement to constitute a public good. But maybe I'm overlooking something or being too critical there.
Again, I'll bring it back to Gitcoin. Again, that's the only platform that I think I've used with any kind of frequency to have an opinion about it. But if you look at their grants that happen on a quarterly basis, you can see a lot of centralized institutions that are putting in money into those grant pools that are then distributed across a variety of different projects that are being voted on by the community, right, through their own money, right, because they have this process called quadratic funding, where the more support you're getting for your project, your campaign, the higher the match. The question could be, what's the incentive for these institutions to be putting in money? I'm sure some of it could be considered, a tax write-off. I don't know. I can't speak for them. But when you see the conversations that are being had between these organizations and Gitcoin and these organizations and the community that is being funded through Gitcoin, you realize that it's to their advantage to support these types of projects, because the more of these projects that are born out of platforms like these, that are funded through platforms like these, the more likely this ecosystem will thrive. I mean, for me, if I learned anything from everything that's been going on in the space over the last couple of weeks, is that we need to lean on these decentralized projects, organizations a little bit more than on these centralized organizations, right? If we want to see this decentralized, blockchain, decentralized identity, whatever, all of these different decentralized ecosystems flourish, we need to fund, these ideas and these creators and these developers to actually make use of the technology. So I see Polygon up here right now as a grantor, for GR15. I see Coinbase, I see Yearn Finance. Like, these are big organizations in the ecosystem. I can see why Polygon would want to have projects receive funding, because it is more likely that those projects, as they prove their concept, can go to that Polygon ecosystem and make use of it, validate it, like allow that ecosystem to grow. So that's just kind of my thoughts based on how this platform works, and some of the incentives to these organizations to fund these public goods.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense, actually, when you explain it that way, and how if there's some organization that's contributing a lot to these quadratic funding rounds, but with certain strings attached, like if there's a certain matching category that is funded from this one organization, then there's probably certain criteria that the projects need to meet to be eligible for that. And in a way, it's almost like the grantor there is kind of investing in their own consumer base, or to try to expand the amount of projects or users that end up engaging with their product or service. So it's almost like a weird kind of roundabout way of some like roundabout return on investment that isn't just as linear as profits, but it makes sense. And in my mind, it seems like it's a pretty good kind of balancing of interests there, but I'm sure there's still ways it could be, unsavory.
I mean, I just think it's all about, transparency, and, that's something that this tech offers is, and actually, it's in the way that you've phrased the notion, Humpty, is that like, well, maybe these, centralized platforms and bigger organizations are making these donations as a tax write-off, which the IRS probably isn't recognizing Gitcoin as a potential tax write-off just yet. But the point is that if it, like, the concept of a tax write-off, like, that's an incentive that, like, we as a polity of people, put into place to actually incentivize these bigger organizations to, give back a little bit towards public goods in most cases. So we kind of cynically say like it's just a tax write-off, but that's actually the system working in the way that we designed it. And what is like new and exciting is with smart contracts and with blockchain, we can more clearly see where this money is flowing and how it's flowing into media outlets' coffers. And you could do the same thing for advertisers and sponsors. Like, all those transactions can be transparent and on chain, and more so the, like, what is allowed and what the ethical code is in terms of how those contributions can influence or should not influence coverage. Like, that can all be transparently coded in. And so, these are just a few of the new advantages that we're working with that I don't think people have even begun to explore yet.
So by coded in, do you mean, physically coded in a protocol to where funds wouldn't actually be physically able to go to specific destinations?
Yeah, like, I could imagine, splits or something, like you have a certain, say like a certain protocol wants to fund a certain like issue area. So like maybe CELO wants to fund climate change coverage or something like that. Well, they could, designate, like exactly how much of their contribution goes towards this, broad issue area. And then you can actually see it flowing into a multi-sig or something like that. And that's just a really basic idea. I'm sure there could be all other kinds of innovations that we haven't even thought of yet.
For me, what makes it a little bit tractable, or like a framework that I think about things, is like what timeline are actors acting on. And so the problem with shared space and the public goods concept with humanity has always been that, like, the people who think in short term can create problems for everyone else who is like either unable to take those short-term opportunities or are kept out of them. And so you get the kings and the feudal lords and all that stuff. And the problem is, if you actually look long term, like, was that actually a pleasant life to lead, like in your castle, like without anybody around telling you anything? I truly think of it in like quality of life. Like Mark Zuckerberg could, buy an island and just hole up there and like live the rest of his life there very comfortably with all these cool toys and stuff while the world burns. But I think we all kind of inherently realize that that's like a bad trade-off, right? And so to mitigate those sort of short-term thinking actors, we have this idea of like the government or some sort of external entity that incentivizes the like long-term investments, so that like these not bad actors but extractive actors don't kind of like ruin the whole game for everybody. And so I think of it in terms of like quality of life. It's like, okay, if Facebook is maximally successful, like, is that even like a world that the people working at Facebook and the people using Facebook would want to live in? And I think in most cases, no, it's not. Like, there's no, it's just extraction, and there's no regenerative qualities to it. Like the people providing the value are not the people receiving the value back in return. And so I think if we assume that like we inherently all want over the long term to have these regenerative economics where we put in value and then we get more value out, and that's kind of like what the boom times in the economy have been, then we really need to revisit these priorities of extraction and short-termism. And I think oddly, like, corporations are finally getting on board with that, like buying carbon offsets, and even if it's just because it's like bad PR to not do that, or whatever the incentives are, like we're finally starting to see like a corporation see the 10, 20-year horizon and be like, oh, I won't be able to do business if everybody dies. So like, I guess that's part contributing back to public goods to sustain these little human batteries that operate my machine.
And along those lines, I mean, we really have to have the onboarding for people that do see what Keith's talking about. And we're seeing it, at Twitter and at Facebook right now, where there's so much chaos and so much upheaval. We need to have containers and onboard ramps for people that are looking for another option, but aren't yet in our ecosystem. I think one of the things that happened last week was that we were able to watch a huge crime happen in real time on chain. And once the dust settles and people understand what actually happened, especially those that aren't familiar with this ecosystem, then if we have these containers for them to flow into, then they can see that long-term vision that Keith's talking about, because there's already a whole community of people working on these solutions in the public good framework. And there's transparency built into the code, like Eric's saying.
Can one of you really quickly, just for listeners who might not understand what happened last week? Yeah, sure, FTX and exchange crashed and it destroyed the crypto market. But what do you mean by being able to watch that all on chain?
Eric, do you want to take this one since you're doing that research, or do you want me to nerd out?
Well, we could tag team it. I mean, I would just say that like for months now, someone in our community, Nick, who's a researcher, I mean, for like months, he's been saying there's like something weird going on between FTX and Alameda Research, and he's been looking at on-chain data since like when I first met him at the beginning of the year, and like he's kind of been saying like I don't know what it is, but like it's sketchy, and so and I think finally CoinDesk had a hand in this, and then CZ from Binance seized on it, seeing that like okay, maybe everything FTX has isn't exactly backed up one for one, and in fact they might be backstopping everything with their own native token. And the footprints of that are all on chain. And then And then the transactions, started happening that just reinforced that thesis, I think. Does that seem like a good quick summary?
Yeah. And when the story started breaking last week, I was trying to ignore it. I'm like, that doesn't affect us. We don't deal with centralized exchanges. That's not our wheel well. And then my brother-in-law, who's a corporate lawyer, he specializes in bankruptcy, he starts texting me on Friday. He's like, hey, do you know what this thing is? I was like, oh, God. So I dove into it. And then Friday night, and I told him, I said, keep an eye on the wallets. And I told him I would show him how, but keep an eye on the wallets. When money starts to come out of wallets that are associated with this exchange, you're going to see who the whales are in this whole ecosystem, because they're going to have early access to get their money out if it's still there. So I was on Twitter looking for something else Friday night, and then I saw one of these data analysts, very much like Nick, post tweeting about money moving out of these wallets in that moment. So I started watching that conversation, and it turned out to be all of the money just flowing right out. And it still remains to be seen how and why that happened. There's tons of speculation, but it was fascinating to see that large of a crime. It's going to be one of the biggest financial crimes ever. To see it happen from people on Twitter just watching blockchain transactions, and they were able to report it in real time. And somebody made the analogy that like this is like the white Ford Bronco moment from like OJ in the 80s, and I actually watched that too, and I'm like, yeah, they're not wrong.
Yeah, it's funny that these random people are just doing it out of the goodness of their own hearts, I guess, or maybe just their curiosity, to just watch the blockchain. Who funds these people, right? And what is a good way to get these people, these investigators, these watchdogs, the funding that they need in a decentralized way? Because what if FTX owned those people? We would probably never hear about it from a centralized point of view.
I mean, I look at the status quo that you're talking about, John, is actually kind of a mess right now, because the people with the skills and the knowledge to really dig into the blockchain transaction are either working for a handful of firms like Chainalysis that have some of the better tools, but like they're not available. They're not making them available to the public. Some of their largest contracts are with government agencies. You have other people who do a lot of this work online and on Twitter and reveal a lot of really interesting stuff, but some of the more prominent ones are all anonymous, which is a problem in terms of incentives and accountability in my mind. So it's crazy. There's actually not a ton of journalists. I can't really think of any right now that are like trained both in journalism and in these kind of blockchain analytics. So it's this like massive void in my mind. So if you're in J school and you want to niche to specialize in, look into it.
Yeah, and we're circling back to the beginning of this conversation. I mean, hackers are the ones that made all this technology to begin with, and they're the ones that are sitting in their hacker spaces together or alone and doing this work. And I was an active member in a hacker space for a long time, and they had day jobs. And their day jobs were white hat hacking, and it allowed them the space and the time to do this work on their own, just from the perspective of a public good. They see it as like a vigilante type approach to just maintain goodness in the world through that type of research. So yeah, they funded that work themselves through corporate money. And they kind of like sticking it to the man that way. By the day I'm getting paid by the man, and by night I'm going to take him down, which is kind of beautiful. And the whole Mr. Robot was based off of that whole premise.
Just one quick point. I was going to say, this kind of brings it back to the public goods thing, which is, most of these tools that have been built to do blockchain analysis, like none of them have been built as public goods. They've either been built primarily to serve investors, crypto investors, or to serve huge corporations or government agencies that can hand out huge contracts. There's not really a super powerful tool that like anyone can easily access, or that was built like as a public good. There's some cheaper ones like Breadcrumbs and Nansen are interesting, but again, like they're really targeting like investors. So like nothing's really been built with the public interest in mind to police this stuff.
Yeah, and we had to use, when we did our open source intel at that hackerspace, we had to use tools that they had access to through their private contractors. So these were extremely high dollar tools, very, very powerful, freakishly powerful. But nobody had access to them. We had to get access through somebody's contract with some other entity they worked for.
I think this is an externality of the software economy being built on user data, because we had these large scale companies and services that appeared to be public goods. I think, Twitter, and maybe less so Facebook now, occupies a space in our heads of like that, we call it the global town square, and it could reach that scale and behave as a public square because it was this company's, it was to their benefit to have as many people on it as possible to like extract as much data as possible. And I think we need to, I'm not sure we have the right model. Like in all of human history, I'm not sure that it exists. And I think that might be why we're kind of spinning around in circles on this one, because I don't think we've ever had to articulate like what a global public good should be, like how the value should be donated or contributed, who and what is allowed to extract value from it and in what ways. And so I think whenever there's uncharted territory, I think it just helps to go back to like first principles, where like if we can at least all acknowledge that like this, having this public good rather than a bunch of like tiny like private things that could go away at any time, and that are completely excludable and rivalrous. Like instead of that, just having a thing that everybody can use. We've seen that be like so good for the economy, for businesses. Like, our biggest businesses are built on like the latest public good. It's like the roads and the trains and the internet, like all these things enabled us to flourish and like reach new heights of technology and equity and humanity. But until that's like a story that lives in everybody's heads, then we're still going to get the short-term actors kind of ruining it for everyone. And maybe we're at the precipice of making a change there. And I see a lot of these like maybe unprecedented opportunities with journalism, and that's why a lot of what we do is experiments at DeJourno DAO, because like I don't think values ever flowed this way before in this ecosystem. I don't think journalists have ever thought, oh, what if I didn't have to give up a net worth like to work on this thing that is important to society, but no one will ever pay me to do.
What accounts do you all think for the success and the staying power of Wikipedia? Because it kind of stands out to me as a public good that has remained so for almost 2 decades, when everything else has kind of been enclosed by, a private platform. But for some reason, and it actually seems like a private company actually could have come in and eclipsed it, but it hasn't. Is it just like a first mover thing? What do you think?
I think so. I think it was the first on the scene, and it became used at scale, and it became almost a verb. So I think it was just the first. And so people maintained it because it became so valuable so fast. And I think a lot of us who grew up using encyclopedias were like, oh, this is great. I don't have to go look it up in an encyclopedia. So, but I think there might also be some funding involved there. I can't remember, and I can't cite it, but I do remember reading some research about the funding behind Wikipedia as well.
But I'm going to call it right here. I think Wikipedia is headed for the same fate as Twitter and Facebook. Like, I just don't think that the underlying problem is that you get a thing with some success, and this applies to public goods, like, because this is one of the reasons why people want to like defund public goods, or like they are cynical about public goods, is, okay, I support this public good being built, like a national park or something. Like, yeah, we should staff it with people, but then like those structures you set up to maintain the public good, over time they just like ossify and crumble, and they become the reason for their being is like their own existence rather than like supporting the public good. And so they don't adapt to like the changing needs of people, of the public good. And then there becomes like this combative nature between the thing, just the entity that has its own momentum and its own like agenda that is no longer necessarily tied to like society's like needs and requirements of the public good. It just wants to perpetuate itself. And I think that's what Wikipedia is in. That's like what Twitter is in right now. And it's kind of lost the plot, right? And like Wikipedia still, for most things, it's fine, but you can find like some really big rifts and holes in Wikipedia where there's just like there's a bunch of subcultures of editors and unpaid people who just have a lot of emotional investment and want to like defend their area, and the incentives just aren't aligned to like make this thing the best for the public to use, whatever those terms are. It is make this what I want it to be as the person sitting here at this point in content production. And let me, just like anything else, let me accumulate power. And I justify that by, you know, my view of Wikipedia is the best view. And so it's okay if I'm consolidating power because that's better for Wikipedia. And so we just get these cycles. And that's why I'm saying, like, I don't know if we have the right model for this, because we need something that's way more dynamic and flexible and can like have the ability built in to be like, job's done, you know, or like we did it. And if we do, then we go away, you know. Like, I think there has to be that potential, or else everything will just kind of like eat itself with its own success.
I'd like to think that it's a matter of value alignment and incentive alignment. You know, I think these are things that have been said in some way throughout this discussion. Whether Wikipedia is next to fall like Twitter, I think it's a matter of being able to describe the value of it and align people who share those values to defend it, and to develop the incentives to encourage organizations to support its independence, right? To remain decentralized and not owned by a single individual like Twitter now is. I remain optimistic only because I see how this technology in the decentralized space, DAO specifically, how there have been these renewed conversations about ownership, renewed, shared ownership specifically, renewed conversations about governance, renewed conversations about incentive alignment. And the most important piece that I think that has been changing in Web3, and I think potentially even, actually I'm betting on this, that it can leak out to Web2 is non-financial incentives. Because if we've seen kind of some of the decline of Web3, at least recently, is because it's developed a lot on top of these very financialized structures. And if we believe that Wikipedia is next to fall because of some sort of financial, structure that can be consumed like it was, over at Twitter, then it's very likely. But if we can imagine there being non-financial structures developed with incentives as well to match, that can support the development of this, of a community, of a protocol, a platform, I think that, there's, that's a silver lining. There's the light at the end of the tunnel. That's the one that I'm running towards.
Yeah, and along those lines, Nathan Schneider's done a ton of work in exit to community concepts, and a lot of DAOs are based on this concept. So that, like Humpty's saying, that the financial incentives aren't there, but the entity itself is exited to the community instead of a corporate entity being exited to shareholders. And I think that's fascinating for me to see that evolve through DAOs. And that gives me hope as well. So that research, I would look deeply into his research because he's been leading that charge for a while now.
Okay, well, we're at the top of the hour. I want to give you guys some final thoughts on this. Now that we're fully entrenched in an ad model right now, and we've seen how terrible it can be, do you think it is possible to completely separate the public good from the business model and the ad model from each other? And how long do you think it'll take? And this is the last question. We'll just go with it from there after we've solved this problem. Crystal, I'll let you start.
Oh, that's such a good one. The optimist in me thinks that we can solve this. I do think blockchain technology will be a huge key in solving it. But the pessimist in me understands that first the collapse has to happen. And I think we went on this tangent with censorship too. I think the systems have to collapse on themselves, which they are doing right now in real time. And then we just have to have the solution for people to come into so that they can understand it and see its value as a public good. And then it can grow from there. And God knows how long that's going to take. I got nothing on that front.
Humpty, you have any last final thoughts on that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I completely agree. I think it's a matter of values. I think in terms of the ad model today, I think it's broken. I think that there's ways to innovate on that. I think that at least looking at it from the perspective of Web3, there is a better way to kind of temp check communities and find alignment between them and the protocols or platforms that they wish to support and participate in. I do believe that in the future, the ad model is going to look very different from the way that it looks today. How exactly? I don't know, but I do believe that there's going to this idea of community is going to be leading the charge in a very interesting way, where people are going to come around a idea, a group of collaborators, a mission, and they're going to want to support that. And I think that they're going to want to put their money where their mouth is to make sure that these organizations and ideas thrive.
Yeah, I think maybe my rants make me seem like not an optimist, but I might be the most optimistic person here. I think we're definitely gonna, I don't know if separating business from public goods is the right framing even. I think it's what we have now, but I think our definition of what public goods and maybe even business is really gonna change in order to solve this, like, which I think it will. Like, I was definitely not optimistic before I came into Web3. And then I was like, oh, this is where all the leaders and like the smart people are, and the people who are like working on these problems rather than just like playing the same games. And so, yeah, that's made me really optimistic. I think, like Humpty said, the shared ownership is like a big factor, because I think when you remove people from like the means of production on the things that they consume, then it's very easy for them to like act in like pathological or toxic ways. And I think the decentralization is really pushing out to the communities, getting smaller, finding your communities, and within that community, it's very easy to like be altruistic and see like the direct result of funding public goods, because you're benefiting from them. And those things, it just gets easier. I think the national global scale is hard, and that's why we're going back to the local level.
And Eric, you get the final word.
I mean, I agree with everything that everyone said, and maybe just one thing to illustrate it. You know, for the past 250 years since the Industrial Revolution, like, technology has, you know, produced these amazing advances, and, you know, they're life-changing at first, and you can push the envelope, and then the technology begins to mature, and then the industrialists of the world turn it into a commodity that just becomes very plain and ordinary and less sexy, and then it tends to start making things worse instead of better, and then that's when in the past the public and the people have kind of stepped in to claw things back and shake it up a little bit. And now we're in the information age, and information, and specifically our attention, is the commodity of this century. And when I signed up to be a journalist 25 years ago, I didn't expect that I would, in 25 years, start to feel like one of those factory workers, just churning out that commodity every day, and churning out the necessary pieces of content to get the necessary amount of eyeballs to attract the necessary amount of advertisers. But that is kind of what my life is a lot of days. And so, yeah, I'm hoping we can, move more in the direction that Humpty is talking about, where we once again say you know what, maybe we don't want to be our attention to be the commodity, and this isn't how we want to be managed. So we're going to decide for ourselves as communities where the value is and how it should accrue and be distributed accordingly.
Nice. Decentralization, community focus to end it out. Anyway, so speaking of public goods, DeJourno DAO has an NFT, and not for speculation, purely to support the mission of DeJourno DAO, and a percentage of that will go to Crypto Sapiens as well. This is the final episode on this. You can find it at cryptosapiens.xyz, and you can also go to DeJournoDAO.xyz and learn about the mission and look into the content of both projects. And thank you guys for jumping on this fourth and final episode, and hope you enjoy it.